Ready to go, Jill? I can start. Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody to this, once again, virtual meeting of Heritage Oakville. It's maybe not the ultimate, maybe not the pre-penultimate, maybe not the pre-penultimate, but we do hope to have live meetings maybe later in the fall, and that would be just lovely. But for the moment, we'll soldier on with the technology we have. And again, we appreciate all of the work that's put in by the town staff to make this kind of meeting possible for us. We have one registered delegation this morning, and the clerk, as usual, will manage people coming on and going off. And if anyone watching wishes to delegate to the meeting, if something comes up that interests them and they feel they would like to speak, then they can call 905-815-6095, and the clerk's department will make the appropriate arrangements. And if you visit oakville.ca, you can pick up the agenda materials if you haven't already done that and you're watching from home. And if you want to participate and you're watching from home, there is a link that you can click on the live stream, which is about a 30-second delay. But you can still do it that way. Committee members are reminded to keep themselves muted until you want to speak. I'll do my best. I know I'm improving, but I'm not yet perfect to catch everybody's indication that they do want to speak. So if I'm not hearing you, unmute and shout, and I'll be sure to pick you up that way. We have 3 discussion items on the agenda today. So let's get the thing started, and I'll ask if there are any regrets, Madam Secretary.
Mr. Chairman, regrets are received from Bob Ferguson and Russ Buckland.
Hey, thank you. Are there any declarations of pecuniary interest with respect to any of the items at the committee today? Brenda?
I just note that I believe I'm looking at Russell Buckland.
Russ, you're
sorry,
silent.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
My mistake.
I'm here.
Sorry. Yeah, Bob Ferguson and George Gordon.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Yes. I heard that, and I thank you, Brenda, for picking it up. Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Are there any declarations of pecuniary interest with respect to the items before us today? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on. And the next item is the confirmation of minutes of our last meeting of June the 15th. These have been circulated and I'm sure read. Are there any comments on those minutes? Would somebody like to give me a motion? Councillor Gittings, so the motion is that the minutes be adopted as circulated. Anyone opposed to that? Seeing none, then the minutes are approved. We move into the discussion items, and I'll just remind everybody that we are an advisory committee. We make recommendations to council, and the Planning and Development Council will deal with these recommendations at its meeting on Monday, the 9th of August at 6:30 p.m. And if anybody wishes to delegate at that meeting with respect to these items, they should contact the clerk's department in advance of the meeting. Okay, the first item on the agenda today then, as a discussion item, is a heritage permit application for 290 Lawson Street. And I think it's Carolyn who's going to handle that for us today. So over to you, Carolyn.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just wait for the presentation to come up. So the item you have for you is 280 Lawson Street. I'll go to the next slide. It's located on the south side of Lawson Street between Trafalgar and Reynolds Street, and it is located in the Trafalgar Road Heritage Conservation District. Next. So again, the property is designated as part of the district, and the original brick portion of the house was built in 1837. It's known as the Samuel Lawson House. At one point, the easterly frame addition was constructed, but we believe it's still to be probably about a century old. The current application is to construct a 2-story rear addition to the house and a 1-story attached garage also to the rear. And thirdly, to replace the windows and siding on the existing house. Next. Just take you through a couple images of the house. Again, you can see the house is located really close to the street. At one point, I think about approximately 100 years ago, the house was relocated within the site and was located really quite close to the street. You can go to the next slide, just showing it along the street edge. Next. And there's one more. Next. Now this is the rear view. You can see the two trees. There is one tree, the one to the left behind that sort of coniferous shrub that's a maple that has been deemed to be in poor condition to come down, and that's where a portion of the new addition is to be located. The larger beech tree that you see closer with the swing, that's to be retained, and the new addition is to use helical piles to make sure that that mature tree is retained. Next. And these are just side elevations. The one on the left is the easterly side of the frame portion of the house, and the photo on the right is showing the westerly side of the brick portion of the house. Next. Showing some windows as part of the application is the replacement of some of the windows. So the two on the left were actually installed in 2009, and other ones on the house we believe were installed in the 1950s. At that time, the house had undergone considerable renovations, and asbestos siding was added to the addition to the house, as you can see here. And from our research, we determined that this style of asbestos was only available after 1949. And a lot of the other features of the windows indicate that they were also installed in 1950s. So we'll go to the next slide. Here are a couple more shots of the existing windows. Next. Some interior views. Another indicator of them being from the 1950s or later is the tubular balances you can see in the far left of the left photo. They don't have the older pulley system with the ropes. They were actually using these tubular balances, and as well as the hardware and the grooves on the muncheon bars are more indicative of windows that were made in the 1950s. Next. And these are two doors that were also part of the existing house. One of them on the left-hand side is to be, they want to remove it and just put siding there instead. The one on the right is actually at the rear, which will be covered up by the addition. Next. So this is the site plan. You can see the house again at the top, located really close to the street. The darker gray is the two-story addition at the back and the one-story garage. And the lighter grays you can see are the covered porches. And again, it's an odd lot. It's a very sort of almost a triangular lot. And again, the house, you can note to the right, is set quite far back because this one is really close to the street. You can also see the new addition, the larger gray square, is stepped in on the sides behind the house on both sides. And the one-story car is quite considerably set back. You can also see here that's where the tree is, right in front of the garage. That's where the one tree is proposed to be removed. And again, the rear larger tree that was in the image, you can see retained here, and that covered porch would be using helical piles to protect it. Next. So this is the front of the house. You can see the brick portion on the right and the frame portion on the left. This is where they're proposing to be replacing the windows. They have changed the design. They're proposing to do 6/6, two sets of 6/6 windows in the lower portions of the larger window openings that exist, and to change the octagonal window to a 4-pane window. Up in the top, they're proposing to keep the 6/6 windows. And the reason for the change was the idea of trying to go back to what was more likely there in 1837. The window openings themselves don't change. You can tell in the brick portion, these are definitely the original window openings. So proposing to keep them and trying to do a style that was more likely there originally and prior to the 1950s changes. Next. This is the rear view of the house. Again, you can see the house is being proposed to be board and batten wood siding with wood trim. They are proposing a stone chimney here. That's as part of the recommendation from staff for proposing that those materials come back to staff for final approval, because we'd want to see the stone be as close as possible to the traditional lake stone for the area. Next. Again, here you can see the one-story single car garage closer to the street or farther from the street, and the rest of the rear addition. Next. And then this is the easterly side. The other thing to note here too is that typically when we have a heritage house, we want the rear addition to have the same roof line or lower. In this case, they've actually proposed to go up farther towards the rear to get a little bit more height there. The existing house is quite low at about 6.8 meters. And so they're proposing to go about 8 meters on the new addition towards the rear. And the way they've done it is it's set back quite far from the front of the house, that from the street it shouldn't be very visible at all to see that increased height. They are still a meter under what they could get in this for the zoning. They could go up to 9 meters. So they tried to keep it low enough that it's not too much of an increase in height from the original house, but it still allows them to get a little bit more height because, again, the existing one is quite low. Next. And I've just got a couple of renderings. So again, this is showing from the street, you can see the single car garage to the right, and the addition would be to the rear behind that. Next. And a rendering from the rear showing the covered porch. The single car garage, at this point, they're proposing to do doors in the back so that they can have access for, the mower or other things from the garage to get access to the backyard. I believe they're still trying to work on some of the landscaping details, but this is what they're proposing right now. And you can again see in the lighter shaded tone the house to the east on the right-hand side. Next. So in terms of our assessment, we look at the district plan. In our view, the historic house and the historic elements of the house are to be retained. One thing I did miss, it's in the report, but the asbestos shingles is over top of horizontal wood siding. What they're proposing is to replace that with horizontal wood siding to replicate what's underneath. A lot of it's been damaged from the asbestos shingles being added. And so they would like to replicate it and restore it back to what it originally looked like. The new addition is stepped in at the rear and therefore helping to minimize its impact from the street. And so the historic house will still remain the prominent building on the property. And again, the garage is significantly set back from the street. It's only a single car garage. The materials and design are considered to be compatible with the house and district. They've continued the gable roof line. They're using wood and batten. And finally, they are protecting the healthy mature trees on the property. Next. So the staff recommendation is that it be approved subject to the following conditions. So the first is that all new windows installed in the existing house be wood windows. They are proposing aluminum clad wood windows for the rear addition, which we are fine with, but all of the new windows on the historic house should be wood to replicate more closely what was there originally. The second one, this is a minor detail, and from my understanding, I think it was a mistake in the drawings, but we'll put this in just to make sure it's covered, that the new 1/1 window proposed for the east elevation of the existing house be a 6/6 window, and that it be located within the existing window opening. The red is just I've added since the report was sent out in the agenda. Thirdly, that final details on paint colors, new windows, doors, trim, wood cladding, and stone material be submitted to staff for final approval. And finally, that any materials approved for removal, such as the rear windows and doors, be made available for salvage. Again, we don't consider these to be heritage attributes, but there might be someone who would be willing to utilize these pieces. So we're just including that in case. And again, that the heritage permit expire 2 years from the date of final approval by council. And I'm happy to answer any questions. And I know Emily from the architect's office is here to speak on behalf of the applicant as well.
Okay, thank you, Carolyn. It's interesting topography, isn't it? I mean, anybody who's walked up Trafalgar or Reynolds knows it's quite steep there, but it was interesting to see the backyard with quite a big piece of terracing there, which they're making use of in the incorporation of the landscaping. Okay, so that was the presentation. Has anyone got any questions that they want to ask of Carolyn? Jerry and I think Kerry, yep.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, Caroline, I just wanted a point of clarification. The 6/6 window, is that on the front elevation?
The one where I've included the condition?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually the easterly side of the house. So it's the east wall of the frame addition. In the drawings, they are, it's showing the window being moved slightly, and it's showing, I think, a 1/1 design. So I just want to make sure it's 6/6. And actually, the applicants do want to do 6/6. I think it was just a mistake in the drawing. But
Okay.
just to make sure we're covering it, I wanted to add it in the condition.
And how are we dealing with the front elevation, the window adjacent to the front door? It's been changed in terms of the mullion sizing.
Yes, that's correct. So as I noted, the windows that were installed in the 1950s, we thought in terms of what the applicants wanted to do, the idea was to go back to do something, a more traditional design of 6/6. At the time when the building was built in 1837, of course, we don't have photographs from that era. So we are, the idea is to kind of go on what you assume will be sort of done at that time. And at that time, there was no availability of larger panes of glass. They were all being shipped from England. So 6/6, 8/8, 12/12 were pretty consistent styles for that era. So the idea from the applicant's perspective was to go back to that more traditional 6/6 look. Typically, we like to base it on evidence as much as possible. What we do know is that the ones that were installed in the 1950s were not the historic ones, and they're not always required to go back to the original. But this was sort of the solution that they came up with in working with us for the windows for the front.
Well, thank you, Carolyn. That's wonderful. So we're going to go back to even a more traditional standard. That's great. Thank you very much.
Hey, Jerry. Thank you. Carrie? You're on mute again, I think, Carrie. You're on mute. There you go, Carrie.
Sorry
Speak
about
out
that.
before it changes again.
Mine showed that I was unmuted. Sorry about that. Carolyn, I was just wondering, it looked like it was an historic stone fence or terrace that Drew mentioned. Is it historic, and is that going to be protected during construction?
Do you mean in the, I guess the rear
In the backyard?
Backyard? It's not something that we had identified as being historic. It will be changed there because, and I can ask Emily to speak to this in more detail, but I know the porch will be getting fairly close to that section, but it's not something we identified as a heritage attribute that had to be retained.
Okay. And are you 100% sure about those windows being 1950s? Because boy, they sure look a lot like a lot of the windows in our house, and so and,
They do.
You know, like a lot of our windows don't have the pulley system.
Through you, Mr. Chair, to Carrie, we were looking at it. They do look older from the outside, especially I think because there's been many layers of paint, so it gets that sort of patina and older look to it. One of the biggest indicators was the hardware, and also again those tubular balances, just because they were more typical of 1950s and 60s windows, and also some of the grooves in the actual muntin bars. There's a lot of different grooves and details that you wouldn't have seen in the older ones. They were a lot more simple and often had sort of a curved element to the actual muntin bars, whereas these have multiple grooves. So the other indication that we helped a little bit was just under the reading through the old Oakville book, where they mentioned that after in the 1960s that the house had just gone through considerable renovations. And so it seemed kind of consistent. And the other thing too was there was this layer of paint that had gone over, the spray paint that had gone over with the asbestos shingles was also applied to the windows, which make it look like it was all sort of done at the same time.
Okay, thanks. I definitely have to have you come over and look at my windows again. My last question, it looks like the new addition is proposed to be extremely close to the edges. I think I noted 1.21 meters. What is proper setback?
So everything meets zoning. So there are no minor variances for this application. It is an odd lot just because of the angle to it, but everything is within the conflict or the regulations of the zoning bylaw.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Kerry. It's always nice to see when the work is done within the confines of the zoning and the other limits, and also with the height, when you talked about that earlier. So it's nice to see people working within those. Any other questions of Carolyn? Okay, and I see Emily has appeared. Thank you, Emily. Nice to see you again. Do you wish to add any comments and perhaps something to do with the landscaping, perhaps you might want to say, but anything else, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Carolyn. You've covered ground with everything, and I appreciate the information. At this point, we haven't really gone beyond looking at what the building is, so we haven't proposed anything for the landscaping, but that's good to note, actually. It just occurred to me when Carolyn was talking about the stone being, lake stone type of material. So that I will go back to the clients, because I know that they are quite keen in trying to make this back to the original. If at all, if they can bring it back to the original. That's what their intentions are. And again, probably with the back having a little bit of modern, accoutrements, so that at least there's some evolution in the way the architectural addition is presented. But again, everything is presented by Carolyn. That's exactly what we're planning on doing.
Thanks, Emily. Just one small comment on that back part, though. I mean, with the terracing, because there's a large mature tree you're going to keep there.
Yeah.
You can't sort of fill that in to level it off, because you'll kill the tree if you put too much additional dirt on top of those roots. So I would imagine that sort of change in levels is going to be maintained. Whether a retaining wall is part of that, I don't know. But you can't put too much dirt on top of those tree roots. They'll starve oxygen then. Has anyone got any questions of Emily? Okay, no, none. Thank you, Emily. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Have a good day.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we've all had a chance to ask questions. Are there any comments on the application? We'll confine it to the board now. Okay, that's good. Oh, Jerry?
I was just going to say, Mr. Chair, that I think that they've handled the design of this very well. The preservation of the house on Lawson Street, the heritage integrity of it has been maintained, and they were able to enlarge it in the rear without too much impact on the front. And I think it's very cleverly done with a challenging lot. So kudos to the designers and the applicant on this one.
Good, Jerry. Then would you like to give me a motion?
Yes, I'd be happy to move this, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. We have the motion now to approve the staff recommendation, and as noted earlier by Carolyn, it's been slightly amended from what you have in your package. You did see it on the screen. Does anyone need to see it again, or were you just comfortable with that small change about the window opening? If you don't need to see it again, if there's no further discussion, is there anyone opposed to the motion? Seeing none, the motion is carried. The recommendation to council is to approve the application. Thank you very much. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you.
Okay, our next item is 4.2, and it's a heritage application, a permit application for Erclas Coach House. It's good to see work happening there, and as usual, when work happens, things get discovered. And this is not a minor discovery, it's a bigger discovery, so it's come back to us for consideration. And is it Carolyn again who's doing that?
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you.
Okay. Carolyn,
I'll
over to you.
do a brief presentation when it comes up, but I think all of you are quite familiar with the site. As you were saying, they have been working on the coach house. over this past year, and they're proposing at this point to look at replacing the siding. Here we go. So we'll go to the next slide, and I think because you're all quite familiar with the property, again, it's on in that sort of shaded blue area in the corner of the Ercles Estate property. Next. So just again, a brief background, is designated as a cultural heritage landscape in 2019. It contains the 1899 shingle style coach house, and it was the original coach house and gardener's cottage for the Ercles Estate. So in the past year, the town has been working to rehabilitate the building as a public multi-use space for the museum. And the previously approved heritage permit included the replacement of areas of single cedar cladding, cedar shingle cladding where needed. And at the time, when a lot of work was done by consultants assessing the property, it was noted that most of the shingles would need replacing within 5 years. That the idea at the time was to kind of just do piecemeal. And now, after doing that and actually doing some of the work on site, they've realized that it really makes more sense to be doing all of the cladding at once, and for a couple reasons, which I'll get into. So now their current proposal is to replace all cedar shingle cladding on the building. Next slide. So again, these are the previous drawings. You had some areas that were identified to have some of the cladding redone, and you can see in some of the lighter tones that they used for the shingle cladding in the drawings, you can see areas where they'd already been patched in recent years. There was a large addition or renovation done in 1997 to relocate the coach house doors back to the south side. As many of you recall, around the 1960s, they had switched them so that the doors were facing the streets to be used for vehicular use, because it was no longer being used as a coach house. And then in 1997, they reversed everything back to the original state. Next slide. So there are other areas here you can see again in lighter shades that had been redone at different times after the 1997 renovation. And next, this is just showing the easterly view and the west view. Next. So we included some historic photographs in the package. You can see in the top left photo, just after the turn of the century, on the right-hand side, this is the front door of the gardener's cottage. And you can see on the right-hand side, the cedar shingles, which have a lot of different natural tones to them. So we know from these older photographs that at one time it was either natural, the shingles were natural, or stained in a way that was a lighter stain to actually see the natural tones of the wood. And at some point, we believe probably around the 1960s, when a lot of the renovations were done, you can see in the bottom left photo, it was painted this sort of purpley reddy brown. I think maybe to kind of mirror the idea of red cedar. And over time, more paint's been added, and it's typically usually been some kind of reddy brown color. And then in 1997, which I think you can go to the next slide, in the 90s, this is the post-90s renovations, they were again painted sort of another reddish brown. And you can see in these photos where patch jobs have been done and painted in colors that didn't quite match. And you can also see the condition of some of the shingles. So there are concerns that if the shingles stay here any longer, you're going to get water infiltration and you're going to have a lot of interior problems. And considering all of the efforts and money and work being put into the building to renovate it and usable as a new multi-use building, it makes sense this time to properly do it. And instead of doing more patchwork jobs, to properly restore it back to the cedar shingles. And the other thing is it's an opportunity to go back to the original natural cedar shingles in terms of a light stain that shows the natural tones, as opposed to the brown paint that's been added. Next slide. So this, you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, I took this photo last week. This is just showing the new cedar shingles that were installed in one portion that was needed to be replaced. And you can see the difference. So again, you've got that natural, multiple shades of brown, the natural color that was more consistent with what we saw in the older photograph. Now, to keep it from going natural and turning gray, They are proposing to use a light stain to keep it a wood color, and they've got a few samples there. And if anyone has any comments today on those colors, they can certainly, Julian here, Kingston is here from the museum and can certainly take that under consideration. But we've left the final stain color up to staff to sort out, but we would be happy to hear any recommendations today. Next slide. So again, in terms of the heritage assessment, typically the goal is to restore rather than replace. With this, the cedar shingles are really at their end of life. They're over 120 years old, and some of them are actually, from the 60s, some are from the 70s, 80s, 90s, etc. And so the idea is to stop any more significant deterioration of some of the building with the older shingles, and to get rid of the patchwork jobs of the building that have been done over the years, and to do one new natural cedar shingle cladding that is more historically appropriate and more consistent with what was there originally. The other thing to note is that there is an easement agreement for the property with the Ontario Heritage Trust, and so they need to approve any of these changes, and they do look to see things being restored rather than replaced as well. So in this scenario, they have approved it, and they believe it's consistent and compatible with the heritage building. And from our perspective, we're happy. We've reviewed it as part of the through the conservation plan of the cultural heritage landscape as well, and we believe it's consistent with those plans as well. Next slide. So our recommendation is that the application be approved with final details on the cladding, such as the stain color, to be submitted to staff for final approval. And again, I'm happy to answer any questions, and we have Julian Kingston from the museum here as well.
Hey, thank you, Carolyn. It's great to see the work starting. This is such an exciting project, and I remember Brenda's input with respect to the windows at the back, and the horses and things that are going to be showing on there. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the finished product. Anyway, are there any questions of Carolyn at this point? Dave, Councillor Giddings?
Thank you, Chair. Through you, curious in terms of what this does to the timing. Are we still on track for fall-ish opening?
Through you, Mr. Chair, to Councillor Giddings, I'll have to leave that question to Julian, but when Julian and I were talking about this process, of course, that was a concern for him, is when I said this has to come back to the Heritage Committee because its cladding is considered to be a significant material. There was some concern, but we got it through as quickly as possible, and I believe the timing will still work out, but I'll leave that to Julian to provide an answer.
Thanks.
Okay, well.
I think that's my entree. So through you, Mr. Chair and Councillor Giddings. So we are on track still for a fall completion. The shingling actually isn't a critical part of it isn't part of the critical path. We don't think it's actually going to be anything that will slow us down. We have found some other, I won't go into too much details, but as our chair referred to, we do discover things on this project, and we have found some other things that we've had to work out as we go along. But at this point, we're still on track for a fall completion. The actual official date is moving back and forth a little bit as we work out some of those details. But yeah, fingers crossed at this point. We're still looking good for fall.
I appreciate that. I'm getting a lot of inquiries from residents as they visit Lakeside and Aircliff, wondering what's happening and when it's going to be ready. So I appreciate that. The other half of that question that goes along with the change in work is, how's the budget doing on this one?
So again, through you, Mr. Chair, at this point, it's kind of the same answer. We're within our budget. We have had some significant unanticipated items come up, but we did also put a healthy contingency against the project. So at this point, we're still on budget.
I would remind Councillor Giddings that the Heritage Committee is a budget-free zone. So
yeah, I will say that very professionally, Carolyn cautioned me to not get too far into this, and I actually, my superiors within my department would probably not like me making too many direct answers around this, but at this point, there's no flags.
No, I appreciate that. I'm on the budget committee this year, so I'll just throw that out there. So
yeah.
citizen, we appreciate your concern.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful project. And last comment, I fully support the staff making use of the stains in terms of the final selection. It's not in my wheelhouse. Anyway, thank you very much.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, if I may, our plan with actually selecting final stains is to do some physical samples on the shingles that we're using. It's really the best way to get an idea of what kind of shade we're going to get. And as Caroline referred to, the idea is to find something that captures kind of it's a clear look, captures the real wood appearance, and it kind of slows down the natural weathering to gray. I think I kind of pitch it as we're kind of capturing the coach house in 1905 in terms of what it would look like.
Good. Thank you. Jerry?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a comment about the actual staining of the cedar shingles. By the way, this is a jewel of a building. It's such a beautiful building. It brings such joy every time I go by it. And seeing it in the drawings, it just reveals the beautiful proportioning. I wanted to just ask if they were getting the shingles factory pre-dipped to increase their longevity.
I could take that, I guess, through you, Mr. Chair. Unfortunately, no, because we didn't get to the. We were still, in terms of the plan, officially supposed to be matching the existing paint, and we were already into applying shingles before we really thought, why are we painting these shingles? It's going to look like, we have an opportunity here to bring back the wood look. But as we had already applied some of them to the building, it's not like we can take them off and dip them and reapply them. That would, certainly. I can imagine I would get some questions from the contractor if we went back to that. So the stain will have to be applied once the shingles are on the building. We did get some really good advice from our shingle contractor in terms of ways to products which in terms of that are recommended, and kind of ones that also a mix of a stain and penetrating oil treatment. So I'm pretty confident that we'll get a good treatment by the time we're done.
Okay, Jerry?
Thank you, Julian. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I can tell you that the shingles you're applying won't last 130 years like some of the other ones have done, but I'm sure that the stain and the oil treatment will assist. Any other questions? Okay, fine, confined to the board. Any comments or discussion on the staff recommendation? Can I have a motion from somebody then? Thank you, Councillor Gittings. So the motion is that the staff recommendation be approved. Any further discussion? Anyone opposed to that motion? Seeing none, the motion is carried. So thank you very much, and thank you for coming, Julian, to help us out with that. Okay, the next item on the agenda is, I guess, more of an information item. It's the Ontario Heritage Act and Toolkit updates, and we have a recommendation to receive that. So who's going to speak to us on this?
That would
be Sue. Hi there, Sue. Nice to see you. Okay, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just ask for the presentation to be pulled up.
Your volume is a bit low. I don't know whether you can adjust that or if that's at the technical end here.
I'll just try to be louder. I know it's probably just my laptop, so is this okay? No, this is not okay?
Shout.
Okay, Mr. Chair, can you hear me now? No?
Yeah, we can hear you. We're fine, Sue.
Okay. I will try to be as loud as possible. And this will be a brief presentation in addition, because as you say, it is an information report. If I could go to the next slide, please. So this is a follow-up report.
Hi, Sue. This is Council Chamber.
Yes.
You're technically, you're very, very low, so you really have to be mindful to shout into your microphone. So there's, can you contact the IT department to get your technology fixed in the future, please? Thanks.
I have. They said this is the best it can be.
No, I'll talk to them, but
Okay.
thank you, just continue, but your volume is low, so for the committee to hear you properly, and for the video live stream to go out, please be as loud as possible.
Okay, so this report is a follow-up on the Bill 108, More Homes, More Choices Act that we heard about in 2019. The report in your in the Heritage Oakville agenda package goes through the changes in the background of this report in more detail. But essentially, there were changes proposed to the Ontario Heritage Act in 2019, but they weren't proclaimed yet. They were waiting on the new regulations to go along with the changes to the Heritage Act. And those new regulations were released last September, and the committee and council saw those proposed regulations, and we provided comments at that time. As well, at that time, they weren't sure when the regulations would be proclaimed along with the changes to the Ontario Heritage Act. And we received notice on June 2nd of this year that the changes to the Heritage Act, the new regulations, would be proclaimed for July 1st of this year. And in addition to that, the ministry also released a new Ontario Heritage Toolkit. And that toolkit contains 5 different guides that help explain to both the public and professionals how the new changes to the Ontario Heritage Act and the regulations will work. Next slide, please. So the regulations, we had, of course, suggested a number of changes to those regulations, as had many other municipalities, but few changes were actually made to the regulations that have been now proclaimed. There are 3 things that I've highlighted in the staff report that have not been removed from the regulations or from the Heritage Act, but they have not been proclaimed. And the ministry has not indicated that there is any timeline for these items to be proclaimed. And so the first is the prescribed principles. And these were a set of guidelines they had provided to us in draft that council was to consider when making decisions that concerned heritage properties. The prescribed principles have essentially been scrapped at this point in time and will not be proclaimed. And we will certainly forward any new information about these prescribed principles when we hear about it, which I don't believe will be anytime soon. The other thing that is fairly significant that has been removed from proclamation at this time are the definitions of alteration and demolition. And this is important because there are new procedures in the Ontario Heritage Act when we are dealing with demolitions as opposed to alterations. Feedback at this time from the ministry indicates that they think that municipalities can come to not necessarily come up with their own definitions, but that they can determine how best to deal with these situations on their own. And then within the portion of the act that deals with heritage conservation districts, they have removed the statement that you are required to consider heritage attributes when you receive an alteration request for a property within a heritage district. And so that's a summary of the changes to the regulations. Next slide. So the bulk of the staff report and the work that staff had to do to prepare the staff report was actually reviewing the 5 new guides that are that form the Heritage Toolkit. And in this presentation, I'm just going to hit on the first 2 guides because those are where the most significant changes have been made. And that's designating heritage properties and heritage property evaluation. And so all of these guides were available online for comment from the public until July 1st. You may remember that an email went out to committee members at the beginning of June, letting you know that these things were there if you did want to look at them. So we have provided comments on the toolkit, and that is attached to the staff report as Appendix A. Next slide, please. So in the Designating Heritage Properties Guide, there are a number of new guidelines to help explain the new regulations and the changes to the Ontario Heritage Act. And these include, there's a new step in the objection or appeal process to issue a notice of intention to designate. So you may remember that when a council considers a property for designation now, the owner is permitted to object to council to that designation, and council has to hear their objection and then decide whether or not to issue a notice of intention to designate. And then there is an additional step in that process for an appeal. There are new deadlines that we are dealing with now to issue a notice of intention to designate after a prescribed event. And prescribed events really relate to things that happen under the Planning Act. That is an official plan amendment, a zoning bylaw amendment, and a plan of subdivision. And so now we are bound by fairly tight timelines after the submission of one of these applications to actually move forward with a designation unless there is an agreement between the property owner and the town to exempt that timeline. And we will certainly be trying to put those exemptions in place wherever possible. There are new requirements for the content of heritage designation bylaws, so you may see some changes in the format of those in the future. There are new deadlines to pass actual designation bylaws, not just the notice of intention to designate. So we have to pass a bylaw actually within a certain amount of time, and that's brand new. We always, previous to this, there was no timeline to pass a designation bylaw after issuing a notice of intention to designate. And of course, the big change is that there is no longer the Conservation Review Board, so all decisions made by municipalities under the Ontario Heritage Act that are subject to appeal go to the new Ontario Land Tribunal. That replaces the LPAT, whose decisions are binding. Next slide, please. In the Heritage Property Evaluation Guide, this is actually a really helpful guide. I'd suggest everyone to take a look at it because they have actually provided a new section that is a thorough explanation of each one of the criteria of Ontario Regulation 906, which is the regulation that defines what cultural heritage value is. It's actually, I think it's one of my favorite changes to the toolkit books, and I think it will assist staff and Heritage Oakville in providing better guidance to council. There's also a new process for listing properties on the Municipal Heritage Register under Section 27, and so these are listed, not designated properties. There is now a process for a notice of intention to object to listing on the Heritage Register that has to be followed. And so you'll see that process cropping up every now and then as we deal with properties on the Heritage Register. Next slide, please. So town staff have reviewed the draft Heritage Toolkit. So that's all 5 documents. And we read through those and provided comments to the environmental registry by July 1st. And as I said, those comments are attached as Appendix A, and they're a little bit more technical than what I've gone through in the staff report, because those comments really were about suggesting changes to wording, requesting clarification. The main thing was that we did request an extension of the review deadlines to ensure that a more thorough review could be undertaken, as I know many other municipalities did. However, we have not heard from the province about any extension of deadlines or any additional review periods yet. Next slide, please. And so the recommendation is that the report be received, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Susan. Are they going to reissue the big fancy dandy colored toolkit? Or are we going to be going to an online resource for information?
Mr. Chair, we haven't yet heard about any publications yet, especially because they are still in draft. So there will be changes made to these documents. If there are hard copies made available, we will certainly let the committee know. Otherwise, we will be providing all with digital links once the information is finalized.
Good, that'll be helpful, because sometimes you want to refer to these when you're looking at an application. Okay, I do wish, I so regret that the practice that's crept in parliaments in Canada, and I think elsewhere in UK, where they give an act, more homes, more choice, as a title. I mean, that's a political slogan. I wish the act it's a legal document and it should legally describe its purpose and intent. And I hate these slogans that they put in. And I guess also the other comment I would make is that, you know, it was OMB, but we didn't have to worry about OMB and LPAT, and now LPAT is OLT or whatever it is, but it's got the teeth back in again. So this time, whereas we went to the Heritage Review process, which was a recommendation back to council to consider or not, now it's a binding thing. It's like OMB again. So if people don't like a decision that is made by council following our recommendations, then they can go off to a binding resolution for that. So that changes the focus a little. And that's why I think some of those terms and the terminology and things need to be so clearly defined at the outset by the government, so that it doesn't just become more billable time for lawyers to actually later determine what these words actually meant. So it's good that you and the other municipalities have tried to focus the government on the meaning of some of those terms that they're using and the processes that they define. Okay, any questions or comments? Thank you, Councillor Gittings. And Jerry?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with your comments in terms of what the words mean. I must admit, just a comment, I'm somewhat concerned that municipalities will be using their direction as to what an alteration is and what a demolition is. And those decisions will go to the land tribunal, Susan, if the proponent doesn't agree.
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes.
And with your counterparts across the other various municipalities, I take it they share the same concerns. Is there any movement to try to come up with a cohesive definition that can be used overall?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, my colleagues in heritage planning across Ontario share these concerns. The focus groups that were offered by the ministry did give us an opportunity to vocalize our concerns as well as submitting them in writing. I honestly don't think at this time that the ministry would accept any actual suggestions on what these definitions would be, at least not from municipal heritage planners. They may be receiving more input from other stakeholders in other areas of interest. I'm not sure. but I mean, should the opportunity arise, we would definitely be willing to suggest, or work with our colleagues to suggest some wording that from a practical application standpoint, would greatly assist us. But right now, the ministry, they heard a lot of feedback about the potential issues with this, and their chosen action is to do nothing.
I appreciate that. Are you aware of whether during the recent provincial cabinet shuffle, is there a new minister in this responsible for this area?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I don't believe so. I honestly, I can't say 100% sure. I don't know if my colleague would know, but I don't believe there was a change.
Or it doesn't really matter if Councillor Duddick and I are able to assist, whether through bringing a motion through council that we could share with other member municipalities. It may not have the desired effect, but both Councillor Duddick and I would feel somewhat uncomfortable sitting back and waiting, at least if we make some attempt. So if we could follow up with you on that, I'd appreciate it. And my question is, will these changes or lack of clarity have any effect on our upcoming update for the old Oakville district, the conservation district?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I don't believe so. The new guide for heritage conservation districts really didn't have many changes made to it, other than the change in the wording for section 42, which is part of part 5 of the Heritage Act, which deals with district heritage permit applications. But you know, in the bigger picture, no, our heritage district review process can move forward pretty much the same as we had originally anticipated.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And just a quick comment before Jerry asked the question. When we do that update to the part 5, the new style of part 5 includes any part 4s that are within the district, whereas before part 4s were carved out of the district and stood on their own with their own bylaw. So I guess there would be some updating of the heritage criteria for changes even before you change the bylaw. I mean, it's another long job to go through all of the part 4 bylaws and update them to the modern concepts. That's a huge job, but it'll be kind of caught up in the part 5 part. I think that's right, isn't it, Sue? That the part 5 part might have more impact on the part 4s than it would have done before.
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. So that change was made to the Ontario Heritage Act in 2005 that allowed us to overlap a Part 4 and a Part 5 heritage designation. So that's what we did in the 1st and 2nd Street Heritage Conservation District when we updated it, but it only had one Part 4 property, the Romaine House. And it was fairly easy to kind of roll into the Heritage District plan, and we haven't actually updated that designation bylaw yet. You know, I think there are definitely more Part 4 properties to deal with in Old Oakville, as well as the new cultural heritage landscape designations for Ercless and for the Oakville Harbor that we have to consider. So there's going to be a little bit of tricky layering to consider when we move forward with that plan update, but I'm confident we'll be able to figure it out, but it will take some careful thought and strategy on how to make sure that the guidance doesn't ever contradict itself.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Sue. Jerry?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have 2 questions. One is, I'll say them all at once, both at once. One is just the general broad scope question is, what generated these changes? Like, why did the government go through this? What's the goal on their side in order to understand why we're going through this process in a simple answer, if you can. And then the second question is, has you know, in 2016, the University of Waterloo Heritage Resources Center provided a document called the Test for Designation, Regulations 906 and 1006. And they provided a lengthy article document testing the designation. Has anything been issued yet from the Heritage Resource Center from the University of Waterloo that can better allow us to understand the process and the testing of these new potential regulations?
Okay, through you, Mr. Chair. The answer to the first question is the More Homes, More Choices Act, whose stated objective, I believe, is to reduce red tape so that the province can construct more homes to benefit families. That is the very short answer. If you would like a refresher on Bill 108, I can send out those staff reports again. But yes, you know, most of the stakeholder input into Bill 108 did appear to be largely from the construction and building industry, and not so much municipal staff, or at least Oakville wasn't invited to participate in that. And so that is where all of these changes stem from. In terms of the regulations, Regulation 906 and 1006 aren't actually changing. The regulations I've been talking about are brand new. And so the Heritage Resources Center at the University of Waterloo would not have had time to produce anything yet. But if they do, we will certainly provide it to the committee just for information, because I agree their resources are, you know, incredibly helpful in explaining some of these things. But for now, like I said, no changes to Ontario Regulation 906. They've just included a more thorough explanation of what each of the criteria mean. And then the rest of the regulatory changes are to the body of the Ontario Heritage Act, really.
Okay, Jerry?
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Susan. I don't understand why more homes would have impact on heritage when the regulations do provide for adaptive reuse. But anyway, that's me. But thank you, Susan. Very, very nicely explained. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jerry. And as you were asking your question, I was thinking of the answers in the slogan. More homes, more choice. And that's just what Sue said. And getting rid of red tape. If heritage gets in the way, well, then let's get heritage moved out of the way more quickly and more efficiently, which is a very sad state of affairs. But that's just me being cynical, and I shouldn't do that. Okay, so any other questions of Sue on this? Okay, then can I have a motion to receive the report? Thank you. I think, Sue, you haven't got your name in lights for this meeting yet. So Sue has made the motion. Is there anyone opposed to it? The motion is carried. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sue, for that. It's a difficult process to go through, and we appreciate the time and effort that you put into it to clarify it for us. Okay, so there are no other information items that I can see. The date and time of our next meeting, which will be virtual, is August the 24th. Now, I'll let you know now that I won't be able to attend because I'm in line for cataract surgery and new lenses and all kinds of wonderful things. And they just called to let me know my dates are August the 4th and August the 24th. I would much rather be here, I think. But I'm sure the outcome will be that we'll actually be able to see much better when people raise their hands and let me know that they want to speak. So that should be an improvement. And so the meeting will begin at 9:30 as usual, and we'll have all the proper notifications. So thank you all again for the gift of your time today and for all the technical support that we got, and Jill for sending me all the stuff that I need to try and make the meeting work properly. And if I can have a motion to adjourn, I think Brenda did that. See, I spotted that right away, Brenda. I have to be looking at that side of the screen, I guess. So we have a motion to adjourn, to which nobody is opposed. The meeting is adjourned. So thank you very much, everybody.